Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Blue Stack Productions, publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm glad to be today here in Dublin with Sinead O'Brien. Sinead, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Welcome back to Dublin.
Yes, I'm always glad to be in Dublin. Now, Sinead, you're the coordinator for SWAN, and I wonder if you could tell the audience what SWAN is, what it stands for, and what it does.
So SWAN is the Sustainable Water Network, and we're a network of 26 environmental NGOs working together, particularly on water issues. And so our members would be both the larger environmental NGOs working with a national remit down to much smaller groups that are working just at a regional level. And I suppose our ethos is that we're greater than the sum of our parts. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the smaller groups in particular wouldn't have the resources to be, sending in a submission on the good agricultural practice for the protection of water regulations, for example. Mm-hmm. So we would do a draft, we would send it to our members, and they would input. So we do some of the heavy lifting for them really on the policy side of things.
Now, the Water Framework Directive, which is really one of the shining lights of the European legislation, why don't you tell the audience just in general, what its purpose is as a directive?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, it came from the halcyon days of EU legislation, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Very ambitious, very far-reaching and far-sighted. So I think what's different about it is it doesn't just look at chemical water pollution. So the objective is that all of the waters of Europe, so that would be the rivers, the lakes, our bays and estuaries, and the coastal waters out to a nautical mile, and not forgetting the groundwater, that it would be ecologically healthy. And so that would take into account the biodiversity as well as the chemicals in the water, like nitrates, for example, but also then critically as well looking at the physical health of the river, for example, like the riparian areas, whether or not it's being dredged, whether there's weirs on it. So it's everything in that water body that contributes to its full ecological health. So that's what's very ambitious about it. Also quite challenging, because how do you encapsulate all of that in a piece of legislation? And then the second thing that was quite ambitious and different about it at the time was that it has as a focus the active involvement of the public and the citizens of the member states in achieving that goal. And also, sorry, not to forget, it also prohibits the deterioration in the status. How they term the ecological health is the status, the ecological status. So no deterioration is allowed either. So it's very ambitious.
It's really a transformation from just the simple quality analyzing the sampling data and then going to the ecological, which is much more complicated.
Much more complicated and complex, and challenging for member states and challenging for scientists. I mean, it has generated an awful lot of research, which is good. And there's one of the other things that's brilliant is that it had quite exacting monitoring requirements, and again, not just the traditional chemical water testing. There's now, you have to do kick sampling, you have to monitor the fish, you have to monitor the invertebrates, so that would be the insects and the other bugs in the water. Also examining the physical form that a river or lake is taking, and how that's been, let's say, modified or interfered with in a way that might impact on the ecology. So very, very challenging.
The public participation was a real change for some of the directives, was it not?
It was.
And what kind of triggered that, or what allowed that to happen?
I think it was the direction that the EU was moving towards, and internationally as well. So it happened around the same time as the Aarhus Convention. And it was just particularly, I think, in relation to water, the recognition that when you think of a catchment, so that's all the area that drains into a river, and all of the interests and the people living there and all of their activities impact on the river or the lake. And the only way that you can really improve that lake or river is by involving all of those people, because those businesses and those farmers and those householders, they're all going to have to change their behaviour in one way or another. And the best way of doing that is getting them to participate and to be actively involved, rather than just coming with a regulation or a rule. You can no longer do this with when you flush the toilet, or you have to now save this amount of water, or you can't spray pesticides here or there. I mean, obviously we need regulations as well, but I think it was the movement in that direction.
And I guess it's kind of makes sense in terms of, because the way in which the framework is directed is through the river basin management plans, right? And those are a whole new concept too, which include a lot of things different than it was before. Tell the audience what those river basin plans entail.
So they're the main tool for the Water Framework Directive, and they're first of all, they have to say what the situation is in a river basin district. So a river basin district is either a catchment or a collection of catchments, and at which scale the waters of a country are going to be managed. And they have to set out what condition those waters are in at the moment, what the objectives are, and then how we're going to get there. And of course that's the crucial part. That's the measures. What exactly is going to be implemented to get the water or water quality and status from where it is now to where it needs to be. And the first cycle of river basin management plans ran from 2009 to 2015, and that was the first deadline for the Water Framework Directive. I mean, we look back now dewy-eyed to think that we wanted all our water bodies to be at good or better status by 2015, which is now 2 years ago. Obviously we didn't make it. So we now have a situation where about half our rivers or lakes are where they should be. Our transitional waters are even less, about a third, and then our coastal waters have been poorly monitored, so it's actually quite difficult to know where they're at. So the river basin management plans now need to set out how we're going to go from there, which is half of all our water bodies not up to scratch whatsoever, to them being at good ecological status or better.
Now, Sinead, there were in the first cycle, which is now kind of ended, 7 basins, correct? Was there, and 2 were cross-border?
2 were cross-border.
And the 5 were within the Republic.
Exactly.
Did you find differences across the basins? Or, that some basins were much stronger ecologically than others? Or?
Yes. The plans themselves were done by consultants and they were very generic. So when you read the plans, they weren't particularly useful, but they did set out what the situation was. So, I mean, just to simplify it, things get worse the further east you come. So, and the further southeast you come. So the water bodies that are in more wilder areas, so along the western seaboard, west, I suppose broadly west of the Shannon, would be broadly in a better condition. The further east and southeast you come into urban areas, so you have more urban wastewater or sewage treatment, which is discharged into rivers and bays, and then also agriculture. So they would be our 2 biggest pressures. So the more intensive agriculture you have and the more urban areas you have, the more polluted the water is broadly.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because those are some of the critical pressures that have to be dealt with. But let me step back a little bit to the process. Who actually was responsible for undertaking the analysis for each river basin? Was it a county council? Was it a group of county councils? Or who was supposed to be doing that?
The first cycle was a bit of a mess, to be honest. And when they published their plans, and then realised, these are unimplementable, and made absolutely no progress in the first cycle. One of the reasons that they decided, and that we all agreed they had been a failure ultimately, was because the governance system was so fragmented. So the Department of the Environment were ultimately responsible, but the local authorities were the competent authorities. So, and they were supposed to work together, but they didn't really, because the most of the substantive work that was done in terms of analysis was done by consultants. So about 50 million euros was spent in the first cycle. Some of it on very good work, some baseline monitoring that was needed and threw up some very interesting findings. A lot of it to consultants. And so those local authorities that needed to understand the water in their county better didn't really, because they weren't really involved. So the second time round, the department has led a more integrated approach.
And of course the local authorities have very little expertise in any of these issues facing them in basin analysis.
Well, I would say it's inconsistent. If you look at the old, let's call it the old-fashioned traditional water monitoring, chemical monitoring, that most of them would have water chemistry labs, so usually they wouldn't be too bad on that side of things. But a lot of it is driven by the expertise or the interest of individual staff. So over the years I would have known where, for example, agricultural pressures were managed well, where there was somebody that was particularly interested, conscientious, maybe had made a good argument to their county manager and got some extra funding. Then in other counties, there was absolutely no monitoring of agricultural pollution. So it was very, very inconsistent.
Okay. Now, how did the public participation work out in this first cycle?
In the first cycle, it was in some ways, there was structures there that we don't even have now, but they were called advisory councils, water framework directive advisory councils, and there was one in each of those river basin management areas, river basin districts. But they were any of our representatives who went to them were just found them so draining, because it was just being talked at by consultants for hours and hours. And then the elected members were on them as well, so of course there was lots of soapboxing and speechifying, and the only really constructive thing that came out of them was stakeholders or representing different interest groups getting to know each other over coffee, building trust where there might traditionally have been a very acrimonious relationship, so which is a very important part of public participation, but it wasn't what they were supposed to be, which was the stakeholders coming together and somehow inputting into the plans, because they actually dissolved for various political reasons to do with the local authorities just before the draft plans were finalised, so they didn't even really have an input. So there wasn't very much input at all.
And who paid for all this? The central government with just central funds?
Central exchequer funding.
Okay. Now let's, if we could focus on it, because one of the functions of the river basin plans is to identify what pressures there are exerting on the ecological status of the waters. Agriculture is clearly one. What was the findings in general about what pressures were happening from agriculture on the river basins? So
I might just give a bit of background actually, because the information that we have now is very, very good. One of the very visionary things that the government did was fund a new unit in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the catchment management unit, and they've hired catchment scientists, and they have gone out into catchments and done really detailed monitoring, and so the findings that are presented in the new river basin management plan are really very interesting and very firmly based in evidence. So what they have found is, some of the things we expected, and some of them are quite surprising. Unsurprisingly, agriculture is by far and away the top pressure. What's surprising is it is 3 times more significant than the next most significant pressure, which is urban wastewater treatment, aka sewage. Yes. So they were always put together kind of as the top 2, and the agriculture sector would always say, if there was any talk about controlling agriculture practices, oh well, what about those sewage treatment plants over there, pumping out raw sewage, it's not us at all.
That's right. So cities people with the sewage from the cities,
exactly. And then there's that kind of rural or urban divide, but they can't say that anymore, because this extremely detailed catchment characterization analysis, which has been going on for the last 3 years, has found that agriculture is a significant impact in almost 2/3 of our water bodies. The next most significant is, as I said, is sewage treatment. Then, actually, if you look at the graph, the others drop off. But also, interestingly, physical modifications is coming in as third, which is very surprising. Physical modifications is that thing that, it's a bit vague as to what it is, but think about weirs, think about impoundments, culverting, channelization of rivers, anything that involves going near a river with concrete or development would be what's termed as a physical modification. So that's third, and that is very significant when we maybe we'll talk later about the floods. The floods
yes,
directive.
I was wondering about that.
There's a link between them. After that, forestry and peat abstraction would probably be the next 2, and then you also have to think that when you're talking about smaller catchments, especially we still have quite a few pristine catchments in Ireland, so they'd be like the highest status water bodies. They are very, very sensitive, and it's very localised. So at that stage you have to go in and look and see what's playing out in this catchment. It could be a septic tank, a few septic tanks, it could be sheep dipping, it could be sewage treatment or agriculture, or a combination. So one of the most interesting things that came out of this new analysis the EPA has done is that 73%, so nearly 3/4 of all our bodies of water, rivers, lakes, bays, are subject to multiple pressures. So that's 3 or more pressures, and I think that's emphasises how important it will be to take an integrated approach to managing our water. So you can't just look at the impacts of agriculture or the impacts on sewage or forestry. You have to look at them in the whole and come up with a holistic way of managing those. And that might involve a discussion with the public, because there may be options whereby you allow intensification of agriculture, but you need a more technically advanced urban wastewater treatment plant, for example. So I think the agencies and the state bodies are really going to have to work very closely if this is going to be a success.
In the first cycle, were there the remedial measures examined and determined for each of the pressures?
Not really.
Okay, so this was really just identifying the status and the measures.
Well, they were supposed to.
Supposed to be, right.
They were supposed to. So basically what they did, the Water Framework Directive requires that all of the legislation that's already in place, it's an expectation that it will be implemented. So for example, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, the Nitrates Directive, and they're the basic measures. And then after that, you have to see what else needs to be done. But in the first cycle, and unfortunately in the second cycle, what the government seemed to be doing is saying, well, look, we'll just carry on implementing the measures we're implementing already. And actually the nitrates regulations are working quite well. Or, we'll get on with implementing the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, but, we're a bit short of money, so we'll do our best. So they basically just put all of the things we're vaguely doing to do with water management between two covers and said, we'll just carry on doing that and kind of see how we get on.
Sinead, does the process in the consultation ever involve the stakeholders, such as the NGOs and the farming organization, getting together and talking these things through with the government, or does that not happen?
Normally what happens is there's like bilateral meetings. So we'll meet the Department of the Environment, and then the IFA or the ICMSA will meet the Department of the Environment and say very different things to them. We are hoping to have a workshop with some of the hill farmers that we feel that we could have, find common ground with in relation to protecting especially high status sites. And I think that's where we need to start. However, the department I would say under pressure from us for the last couple of years, have now committed to setting up a national water stakeholder forum, and that will be all of the stakeholders sitting together, thrashing out our differences, I guess, and coming up with common messages in relation to the plan.
And are you finding there are large differences between the small hill farmers and the larger agri-food business interests?
Yes, I mean the more powerful agricultural representative bodies, obviously the IFA in particular, really represent the interests of big farmers. They don't really represent the interests of farmers that are really, clutching on by their fingernails on marginal land whatsoever. Because if they did, they would have supported calls for better measures in Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy to support farmers to deliver on public goods, to deliver on biodiversity, on water quality, on landscape values, on tourism. So when people think of beautiful Ireland, that's what they think of. They don't think of huge fields of barley down in the southeast, or massive dairy farms with the fields divided off with electric fencing. With just a uniform sward of ryegrass. That's not what people come to Ireland to see. That's not what is going to protect our water quality. It's not what's going to protect our biodiversity. And I think the hill farmers who are on more marginal land, they have a lot of common, a lot of what we would want in terms of protecting water, agricultural practices and protect water, would also support them.
Now, in your consultation on this second cycle, you're going to include what measures the SWAN and the environmental groups believe should be implemented in order to relieve the pressures from these certain activities. And who decides whether those measures will be included into the Basin plan?
That's probably the million-dollar question. It's unfortunately that decision is not evidence-based, it's politicised. That's the reality of it. So ultimately the minister decides, and the minister is advised by his scientific advisors. So that's probably where the ultimate decision resides. And so a lot of it depends on the degree to which the scientific advisors are willing to put pressure on the minister to make the evidence-based decisions, and ultimately the the degree to which the minister is minded to even take notice of that.
Okay, and that's maybe public pressure as much as anything else.
Exactly.
Now, Sinead, one thing I think we maybe should step back to is that the phase 2 consultation is a little different in that we're now down to just one river basin plan, right? Instead of the 7 before.
Yes.
And what was the rationale for that change?
I think they felt that and we were kind of neutral. There was, differences of opinion in the network on this, and ultimately I think we were neutral on it. That, in the European scale of things, the river basin districts were very small, and a lot of the issues that need to be addressed are either national or they're at a catchment or sub-catchment level. So the units didn't particularly make sense. So what they've done now is they just have one river basin management plan for all of the Republic of Ireland territory, and then they have a tool that the EPA catchment unit is using where they look at the catchments and then they look at the sub-catchments, and they will be the management units.
SWAN doesn't get involved with actually working to implement those remedial measures, correct?
No, we don't. I mean, what we do is we look at the research, and then we put as much pressure as we can to get those measures implemented.
Now, who is going to be responsible for seeing that the measures are implemented? The department, the minister?
The minister is ultimately responsible, and then they're setting up. We haven't seen it yet, and I'm not convinced how well they're going to work. Regional implementation coordination groups. If I was to be pessimistic, I might say that it will be another gathering of bureaucrats. So it remains to be seen how it will work out.
And are there plans for the SWAN or other ENGOs to be included within those regional bodies?
No, we asked and they said no.
They said no?
No, they've said no. There's a very, very embedded culture in the department of not allowing environmental NGOs or maybe other NGOs to participate in decision making.
Will the EPA new unit be included in that?
Yes.
Okay, so at least there's some hope there. And you have some, I assume, pretty good connections with that EPA unit.
Yes, we work very well. We work very well with them, and they're very good at providing information. Now, there probably wasn't there before about what pressures are in a particular area. Just what the current status of our water is, and they're also doing a lot of good work on public awareness raising. Now,
maybe we can finish up with raising another issue. When you were talking about the kind of hard structures, the grey structures, as we sometimes call them, in terms of modifications of water bodies, and you mentioned the floods implications. That there is the floods directives, and that, as I understand, is supposed to be tied in with.
Yes.
And how is that working?
It's not working very well in Ireland. Despite what the officials say, there was very little communication between the floods, between the organisation, the state department that runs floods management, the Office of Public Works, and the Department of the Environment or Housing, and the EPA. And I think one of the things that has come out of the Water Framework Directive, and that I think was known in Australia and America a long time ago, was that you need to take an integrated catchment management approach, which is what the Water Framework Directive encapsulates, even though it doesn't use those words. And that's the framework under which the new EPA unit is working, and that's the approach that we advise. And the floods, obviously managing flood water, also needs to fit in with that integrated catchment management approach. And so they would need to work very closely with the integrated catchment management unit, but they haven't been. So the OPW is very much charged with protecting humans and businesses from flood water, and they are not interested in an integrated catchment management approach. They've discussed it, and they sit on various. The EPA will sit on their steering group, and they'll sit on this other steering group, and they say that's an integrated approach, but it's not. It's a very much an engineer-led approach. And so what we've proposed is that they would do a catchment scale pilot project to look at all of the different measures that could be taken in a catchment and how effective they might be, and quantify them, and they're utterly resistant
to that, just even as a model or as a pilot project. Do they take into consideration the projected climate changes with the projection on the floods?
They do. They love their models. They've it all modelled.
They're buying into that then?
They are.
Okay.
They are. I don't think that's something, it's not my area, but I would imagine that that's something that they've any of the presentations that they gave, they always show, you know, the different climate change projections on different lines.
Okay.
So I'd imagine that's something that they are covering well.
It's always good to end an interview with a sign of hope, so we should stop right here, Sinead.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for talking to me.